Okay, it's great to be giving this guest lecture today as part of your Research and Applications module. So today I'm going to be talking about deer management in the UK. So by the end of this lecture, you'll be able to describe the social and ecological impacts of deer in the UK, and then you'll be able to discuss the challenges to managing deer. So we have 6 species of wild deer in the UK, and these all vary in their distributions, as shown in blue on those maps. Now, just 2 of the 6 species are native, and that's the red and the roe deer. The other 4 species have been introduced. The fallow were introduced from the Eastern Mediterranean regions by the Romans about 1,000 years ago, while the muntjac, sika and the Chinese watered deer, they've been introduced over the last couple hundred years from Asia, having escaped from gardens, deer parks and zoos. Now, from these maps, we can see that the New Forest National Park on the doorstep of the university is home to 5 out of all 6 of the UK species. And it's not long until we'll probably get the Chinese water deer and get all 6. You can see it's pretty close. So it's widely understood that deer populations of all species are increasing in both their distribution and their numbers across the UK. And reasons put forward to explain these increases include warmer winters, which means low infant mortality, a lack of large predators, and also due to recent tree planting efforts, which have created favourable environments for deer. So why should we care about increasing densities and distributions of deer in the UK? Well, at high densities, deer can exert negative impacts on our woodlands. So photos on the right there show how a woodland before and after a population of fallow moved into an area in southern England. And we can see that by grazing and browsing on plants, deer can totally decimate woodland understories. And these have knock-on effects on insects and bird communities. And by browsing on newly planted or regenerating woodlands, deer are seriously undermining or threatening tree planting initiatives. So these are contrary to the government's ambitious woodland expansion targets as part of our net zero strategy. Also, deer threaten productive forestry because deer like to strip the bark from trees with their teeth or by rubbing their antlers on bark as well in territorial displays, and therefore they reduce the economic value of any timber that we're trying to produce. Now, deer can also negatively impact agricultural production. They do like to feed on and trample cereal crops, particularly maize. They also cause yield losses because their poop gets sucked up into combine harvesters and there's an issue of contamination with the food we're trying to produce. So that's a big issue too, and that can cause significant losses to farmers. Now, deer also pose a risk to public health. So they're really important to the survival and movement of ticks that carry Lyme disease. That's a bacterial infection in humans that can cause serious illnesses if left untreated. And deer also threaten public health by being involved in about 74,000 road traffic accidents per year in Great Britain. So that's a serious issue as well that needs managing. So what do we do about it? What are approaches to managing deer and mitigating against their impacts? And what are the challenges that these different approaches give rise to? So let's look at them. So a really common method is fencing. So erecting deer-proof fences around large areas to protect, for example, newly planted woodland. Now, obtaining the raw materials for fencing is super expensive. It's prohibitively expensive, especially since Brexit. And fencing entire woodlands, not only is it quite ugly, especially in like protected areas where we visit them because they're beautiful, it can also reduce the mobility of other animals of conservation concern, such as otters and badgers. There's also a welfare concern there because deer regularly become entangled in them. Another method is the use of chemical repellents. So, for example, tricho shown here, that's made from emulsified sheep fat. Now, because it can get washed away in the rain, it requires continual application and it requires application to individual trees. So it's extremely labour intensive. So if you're trying to reforest a really large area of land, tricho just isn't going to be a sensible option. Another approach is the use of scaring devices that emit recordings of predator vocalizations, such as wolves howling or sounds of dogs barking. Now, these aren't so effective because deer can learn to habituate quite quickly because they're super clever, especially fallow deer. Now, another way to mitigate against deer impacts is through the choice of tree species that get planted. So deer do prefer to eat some species over others. So landowners might mitigate against damage by planting a less tasty tree species. So, for example, by choosing to plant birch rather than sycamore. However, there is a limitation here. The choice of species that we can plant is also constrained by other factors, such as suitability of a particular species to a particular soil type or the management objective in question. So there's constraints there and limitations to what species we can plant. Now, the previous approaches I just went through, they don't actually reduce deer numbers. They kind of just push deer to other parts of the land. The only way to reduce population size at the moment is with a rifle. Now, culling operations do happen on a large scale, and these are carried out mostly by dedicated deer stalkers. So in the New Forest alone, between the months of November to March last year, 3,000 deer were shot across the New Forest by dedicated deer stalkers hired by Forestry England. So that's a hell of a lot. But deer culling is also carried out by hobbyists or those who do it for recreational purposes, who might wish to consume the meat from deer, the venison, for example. Now, the challenges to implementing lethal control are a little more complex than the other methods. So let's look at the problem. Why is lethally controlling deer such a challenge in landscapes across the UK? Well, deer are classified as res nullius. That means they're owned by no one. Now, only two things are required to shoot deer. That's a gun licence and permission from the landowner. Now, deer, they're highly mobile animals and they regularly cross jurisdictional or administrative boundaries. Now, the home range sizes do vary by species and also seasonally, but in general, they can be very large. So a red deer stag, for example, can cover about 40 kilometres in a single year. Fallow herds can move several kilometres in a single day. So you can imagine that effective management requires a really joined up approach, because any gaps in that landscape will effectively become sanctuaries for deer that they can hide in to avoid being shot. However, in the UK, rural landscapes, they comprise these patchworks of land users and landowners, and it's really challenging to achieve a joined up effort. And this is because landowners in a given area, they'll vary in their management objectives. Also their awareness of deer impacts and their views on deer management. So what are the different kinds of views that people can have towards deer management? So for some, lethal control of deer is just wholly unacceptable. Deer are beautiful animals that deserve to live. Perhaps people who grew up watching the film Bambi as children cannot fathom the idea that they are shot. So for others, deer might provide a valuable source of income, such as by photography or through venison consumption, for example. So these people might want large populations of deer to make these recreational pursuits of theirs a lot easier. Now, perhaps some landowners might not favour culling because they are visited potentially by wealthy trophy hunters that come over from Europe every year and pay for permission for the right to shoot on the landowner's land. Now, trophy hunters, they tend to favour males over female deer because of the decorative antlers. But of course, if you're trying to do population control, you should be targeting the females, not the males. So that doesn't really achieve any control. Now, even if a landowner is supportive of lethal control, perhaps their effort just is not high enough. Often it's carried out by individuals just at the weekend when they have time, if they're working full time, or only during fine weather because it's not nice getting up at the crack of dawn in the winter, for example. And if you want to really achieve control, you need to be doing it consistently. So finally, some people might not engage with management simply because they're not aware of the impacts that deer are having on their landscape, because they're elusive creatures and people might just not know. So if landowners vary in their objectives or their acceptability of lethal control, the result is ineffective deer management. Deer will continue to grow in numbers as long as there are sanctuaries for deer to hide in and avoid being shot. So what are the solutions to this challenge? So as I said, a major issue is that many landowners simply aren't aware of the potential of deer impacts on their land. So many initiatives have been designed just simply to raise awareness of deer impacts. And one of these projects is my project. It's called the iDeer project. So the iDeer project is trying to develop a decision support tool that encourages landowners and local authorities to proactively consider deer management when planning to plant a new woodland. So at the conception stage, when they're thinking about planting new woodland. So what the iDeer project does, we developed a decision support tool, and it generates a map of deer damage risk to woodlands across a defined landscape as defined by the user, so the area that they're interested in planting new woodland. Now, the iDeer tool is underpinned by a model that predicts risk by incorporating spatial information on factors that influence deer movements, such as land use, roads, and topography. So these are all factors that influence deer movements and therefore the risk to an individual woodland parcel. The tool outputs these risk maps, that show the risk of damage to individual woodland parcels. And the idea is that these can then feed into woodland creation grant applications, so that if people are aware of potential deer impacts to the woodland that they intend to plant, they will take a proactive approach to deer management, perhaps liaise with their neighbours, establish the likelihood of coordinated management, and if that's not possible, they might need to rethink what species of tree they plant, for example. So if you'd like to read further on this topic, then here's some recommended reading. And to finish off, now you can describe the social and ecological impacts of deer in the UK and discuss challenges to managing deer and mitigating against their impacts. Nice.